Hey there, I'm so glad that you have tuned into another episode of US History Understanding This Country. I am your host, Santhosh Janardhanan, and if this is your first time here, welcome. And if you have been following along, thank you for coming back once more. I am building this podcast solo with a lot of passion and a whole lot of reading, and every play, share, or rating really helps keep this going. So, if you are enjoying this journey, please consider following, leave a review, or just telling a friend. It means a lot to me. Alright, let's dive into today's story. The presidential election of 1824 was one of the most controversial in US history. With the Federalist Party gone, all the major candidates were Democratic Republicans, but they represented very different visions for the country. The four main candidates were Andrew Jackson, a war hero and a populist, popular among the common people; John Quincy Adams, a diplomat and son of former President John Adams, supported by New England; Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House and architect of the American system; and then William Crawford, Secretary of the Treasury, backed by traditional Southern elites. Jackson won the most electoral and popular votes, but not a majority, so the decision went to the House of Representatives. Henry Clay, who finished fourth and was eliminated through his support behind John Quincy Adams. When Adams won the presidency, he appointed Clay as the Secretary of State, leading Jackson and his supporters to claim that a corrupt bargain had been struck. Jackson's supporters were furious and spent the next 4 years attacking Adams, setting the stage for a dramatic rematch in 1828. The election of 1828 was a political revolution. It was no longer just a contest between elite politicians, it was a battle between the old political establishment and the rise of the common man. Andrew Jackson, fueled by resentment over the 1824 corrupt bargain, ran against John Quincy Adams again, but this time the race was personal and bitter. The campaign was filled with smears, attacks, and wild accusations, making it one of the dirtiest elections in the history. Jackson, appealing to the common people, won by a landslide, marking the birth of Jacksonian Democracy, a political movement that expanded voting rights to all white men, not just landowners, and then emphasized the power of the people over political elites. And he favored a limited federal government but strong executive authority. Jackson's presidency shifted American politics, making it more democratic in some ways, but also more divisive. His enemies, including Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, began forming a new opposition party, the Whigs, who would challenge his authority in the coming years. In 1832, Jackson was seeking re election, but he faced a major challenge, not just from the Whig Party, but from his own vice president, John C. Calhoun. The biggest issue of the election was tariffs. The tariff of 1828, nicknamed the Tariff of Abominations, had angered the southern states, especially South Carolina. South Carolina depended mostly on foreign trade. Calhoun, now leading the charge for the states' rights, argued that states had the right to nullify federal laws they found unconstitutional. This led to the nullification crisis, where South Carolina declared the tariff null and void and even threatened to secede from the Union. Jackson responded with force, sending the military to enforce federal law and warning that secession would mean war. In the end, a compromise was reached, lowering the tariff gradually, but the crisis highlighted a growing issue. Sectional tensions between North and South were escalating. Jackson won the re election in 1832, but the debate over states' rights versus federal power would continue and eventually lead to even greater conflicts in the coming decades. These three elections marked a dramatic transformation in American politics, from elite controlled elections to mass democracy, from economic debates to sectional crisis, and from unity to deepening divisions that foreshadowed the Civil War. By the mid 1830s, Andrew Jackson's presidency had fundamentally reshaped American politics. His strong willed leadership style and controversial policies had polarized the nation. The Whigs, led by figures like Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun, emerged as a direct challenge to Jacksonian democracy. They believed Jackson had abused executive power, especially with his war on Second Bank of the United States. The Whigs named themselves after the British Whigs, a party that had historically opposed monarchs with too much power. They called Jackson as a tyrant, calling him King Andrew I, because he vetoed more bills than any previous president, including the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States. He ignored Supreme Court rulings, particularly in cases involving Native American land rights. He expanded presidential authority, making executive branch far more powerful. Whigs supported a strong Congress, economic development, and internal improvements, policies that aligned with Henry Clay's American system. They found support among business leaders, merchants, and those who feared Jackson's populist approach. Jackson's handpicked successor, Martin Van Buren, inherited both Jackson's supporters and his economic problems. This would soon spiral into one of the worst financial crises in early American history. Shortly after Van Buren took office in 1837, the US economy collapsed into full blown depression. The cause of the Panic of 1837 were complex, but Jackson's economic policy played a major role. Jackson had killed the second bank of the United States, which had helped stabilize the economy. His specie circular policy, which required land purchases to be made with gold or silver instead of paper money, this drained banks of hard money. Speculations in land and railroads had led to inflated prices and reckless lending, and when credit dried up, the bubble burst. The results were catastrophic. Banks collapsed, leading to widespread financial panic, and unemployment soared with businesses failing across the country. Farmers lost their land, and many Americans sank into poverty. Van Buren, a skilled politician but an unlucky president, was blamed for this crisis, even though Jackson's policy had largely set it in motion. His refusal to use federal intervention to fix the economy, believing in laissez faire economics, only made matters worse. The Whigs capitalized on economic misery and positioned themselves as party that could restore stability and prosperity. In the next presidential election, they would run a new kind of campaign, using songs, slogans, and populist messaging to defeat Van Buren. The result? One of the most memorable political slogans in the US history, Tippecanoe and Tyler Too. By the 1840, the United States was still reeling from the panic of 1837. Unemployment was high, businesses were failing, the public frustration with the President Martin Van Buren was at all-time high. The Whigs saw a golden opportunity to reclaim the White House. And they seized it with one of the most iconic political campaigns in American history. Their candidate, William Henry Harrison, a former general and hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. Their strategy, a full blown populist movement, borrowing tactics from the very man they once despised, Andrew Jackson. The Whigs knew that Harrison wasn't a brilliant speaker or a policy mastermind, but they also knew that it didn't matter. What Americans wanted was a relatable, heroic figure, and Whigs packaged Harrison just as that. They branded him as a simple frontiersman, a rugged war hero who fought against Native American forces at Tippecanoe. His running mate John Tyler completed the ticket, leading to catchy and now famous campaign slogan Tippecanoe and Tyler Too. The Whigs held huge rallies, parades, and festivals, handing out log cabin whiskey bottles, campaign songs, and even souvenirs. Meanwhile, they mocked Van Buren, an out of touch aristocrat, calling him Martin Van Ruin, blaming him for the ongoing economic depression. The reality, Harrison was not a frontiersman at all. He came from a wealthy, well connected family. But the Whigs had mastered the art of political branding and it worked. Harrison won the 1840 election in a landslide, marking the first Whig victory in US history. But fate had other plans. Harrison, now the oldest president ever elected at the time, he was 68 years old, delivered an extremely long inaugural speech in cold weather without a coat. Just a month later, he died of pneumonia, becoming the first US president to die in office. His death threw the Whigs into a political chaos. Vice President John Tyler, a former Democrat, took over, but he quickly clashed with the Whig leadership. He vetoed many of their key policies. The Whigs had won the presidency, but they struggled to control their own administration. Though the party would continue to play a major role in American politics, their internal divisions foreshadowed deeper conflicts ahead. Conflicts that would eventually shape the fight over slavery, expansion, and the future of the Union. By the 1830s and 1840s, the idea of going west had become something more than just a scattered movement of settlers chasing farmland. It had become an engine of national identity, a political direction, and for many, a divine calling. The earlier waves of westward expansion, right after the Revolution and into the early 1800s, were about settlers cautiously crossing the Appalachians. looking to stake claims in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio Valley. It was adventurous, yes, but also piecemeal and mostly personal, driven by the hunger for land and freedom. But by the time Andrew Jackson was president, westward migration had turned into a full scale national project. The US government wasn't just tolerating settlements beyond its borders, it was actively encouraging and facilitating it. Roads were laid, treaties were signed and often broken, and millions of acres were being opened up not by negotiation but by force. This era's migration was different for several reasons. It was faster thanks to improved transportation, steamboats, canals, and early railroads. It was backed by federal policy like the Indian Removal Act, which pushed native people off their lands. It was deeply tied to the economy, with fur trade, land speculation, and access to Pacific ports driving the momentum. It was culturally and spiritually charged. Americans began believing in manifest destiny and the idea that they were divinely chosen to spread the civilization westward all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But this migration was not just about white settlers chasing dreams. For Native American nations, it was a nightmare for broken treaties, forced marches, and cultural erasure. And so, this new chapter of westward migration is filled with contradictions, hope and horror, freedom and dispossession, invention and destruction. In the coming sections, we will explore how the US government pushed for expansion, reshaped the land, displaced entire people, and sparked resistance, resilience, and tragedy. Let us go back a little bit. In 1930, under President Andrew Jackson, Congress passed one of the most controversial and consequential laws in US history, the Indian Removal Act. On paper, it was presented as voluntary exchange of lands, where Native American tribes living east of Mississippi River would relocate to the lands in the west. But in practice, it became a brutal and often violent policy of forced displacement. For Jackson and his supporters, the logic was clear. America was growing. The land east of the Mississippi, especially in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee, was rich in cotton producing soil, but it was also home to the five civilized tribes: the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and Seminole, who had lived there for generations. Many of these tribes had adopted European style practices, building schools, churches, newspapers, and even constitutions. The Cherokee Nation, in particular, had gone to great lengths to coexist peacefully, hoping that assimilation would lead to acceptance. But the reality was harsher. White settlers wanted the land, Southern politicians wanted to expand slavery into it, and Andrew Jackson, long known for his hostility towards native people, wanted them gone. The Cherokee Nation, led by figures like John Ross, didn't take this lying down. They challenged Georgia's effort to seize their lands, taking their case all the way to the US Supreme Court. In the case of Worcester v. Georgia in 1832, the court, under Chief Justice John Marshall, sided with the Cherokee, ruling that Georgia had no authority to impose its law on Cherokee territory. It was a moment of legal victory for native sovereignty, but Jackson refused to enforce the ruling. He famously quoted as saying, "John Marshall had made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Whether he said it or not, his actions spoke volumes. Jackson ignored the court, and the federal government pressed forward with the removal. Under the Indian Removal Act, thousands of Native Americans were pressured, bribed, or threatened into signing removal treaties. Some went peacefully, many did not. What followed was a series of forced relocations, long marches, often under military escort, where families were uprooted with little warning, stripped of their possessions, and forced to travel hundreds of miles to what is now Oklahoma. In the late 1830s, the Cherokee people found themselves standing at the edge of a national promise shattered. Despite their efforts to coexist, to build schools and churches, to print their own newspaper in both Cherokee and English, and even to adopt a written constitution modeled after the US system, they were forced from the lands they had called home for generations. Their removal was not just a product of policy, it was the result of a slow, grinding betrayal. The Treaty of New Echota, signed in 1835, became a legal excuse for their expulsion. But it was a treaty in name only. The men who signed it did not represent the majority of the Cherokee Nation. In fact, their principal chief, John Ross had gathered over 15,000 signatures in protest, a powerful demonstration of collective refusal. Still, the federal government ignored the protest. The ink on the treaty gave Washington the justification it needed. Then came 1838. The US Army arrived in the Cherokee lands with orders to remove the people by force. Soldiers went from house to house, rounding up families at gunpoint. Entire communities were driven from their homes with little notice. The Cherokee were herded into stockades, makeshift prisons, where they waited in squalid conditions before the march towards west began. And then they walked. Over 16,000 Cherokee men, women, children were forced to march nearly 1,000 miles to what the government had designed as Indian Territory in present day Oklahoma. The journey took place over months through blazing summers and punishing winters. Many had no shoes. Blankets were scarce. There were no wagons for elderly or the sick. Diseases quickly took hold. Cholera swept through the camps. Dysentery, fever, and exhaustion claimed thousands. There were no proper burials. People were often left behind, buried hastily in shallow graves or not at all. Mothers carried children who died in their arms. Elders collapsed from hunger and were never seen again. By the time the survivors reached Oklahoma, it is believed that between 4,000 and 6,000 Cherokee were dead, nearly a quarter of their entire population. The Cherokee called it Nunna Dal Tsuni, the trail where they cried, and yet the term Trail of Tears came to symbolize not just their suffering, but the forced removals of all the five tribes Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, who were each subjected to their own versions of this brutal march. It was at its core a human catastrophe cloaked in legality, a cold, systemic stripping away of land, of identity, and of dignity. The law, through the Indian Removal Act, had promised a negotiated relocation. But what actually happened was nothing short of a forced exodus, fueled by land greed and racism, and justified by a twisted sense of progress. And yet, not all the tribes surrendered. In Florida, one native nation made it clear that they would not go quietly, not without a fight. In the dense, mosquito thick swamps of Florida, the Seminole Nation decided they would not be removed, not through treaties, not through intimidation, and certainly not through the promise of Andrew Jackson's government. Unlike some other tribes, the Seminoles had never fully trusted US agreements. Their people were a blend of native groups and escaped African slaves, often intermarried, who had carved out lives in the wild, untamed parts of Florida where few others dared to venture. The government called them rebels. They called themselves home. When the Indian Removal Act was passed in 1830, the federal government assumed that it was just a matter of time before all native tribes would be gone from the southeast. But the Seminoles had other plans. Tensions mounted when the US officials demanded that the Seminoles relocate west of Mississippi. The government even sent representatives to force signatures on removal treaty, known as the Treaty of Payne's Landing. It was in 1832, but the treaty was disputed. Many Seminole leaders said that they had signed it under duress, and some denied its validity altogether. Among those who refused to submit was a fiery young warrior named Osceola. Though not born into leadership, Osceola's passion, defiance, and the charisma made him a natural figurehead for the growing resistance. In 1835, when US authorities imprisoned several Seminole leaders under the false flag of peace, tensions erupted into open violence. What followed became known as the Second Seminole War, and it would turn into the longest and costliest Indian war in US history. The war wasn't fought on open battlefields with clear lines. It was a guerrilla campaign in the swamps, thickest, and bayous. The Seminoles used the land to their advantage, launching hit and run attacks, ambushing US soldiers, then melting back into the wetlands. They knew every tree, every bend in the river, and every hiding place. The US Army, on the other hand, was bogged down with unfamiliar terrain, disease, and supply shortages. Osceola became a symbol of this defiance. But in 1837, in an act that shocked even the US citizens, Osceola was captured under a flag of truce, a gross violation of military honor. He was imprisoned and soon died in captivity from illness, But by then, the resistance had taken root deeper than one man. For 7 years, the US government poured men, money, and resources into Seminole conflict. In the end, while many Seminoles were forcibly removed into Indian territory, a small number held out in the Florida Everglades, where their descendants still live today. Seminole resistance wasn't a quote unquote victory in the traditional sense, but it was a powerful stand against erasure. They refused to disappear quietly, even as a machinery of American expansion rolled forward. And rolled forward it did, westward, toward new trails, new hopes, and new hardships. In the next chapter of this expansion, Americans weren't just taking, they were also seeking trade routes, religious freedom, and places to start over. One of the earliest doors to that dream opened in the far off lands known as Oregon Country, and that's where we are going to leave the history today. In the next episode, we will dive into the different trails people took in hope of a new start with a blank page, a new life. It is indeed a story of suffering and perseverance. If you like this episode and this podcast, I wish you could rate this podcast wherever you are listening this on. Until next episode, this is Santhosh Janardhanan signing off. Take care, stay curious, and keep exploring history.